5 True Scary Stories. The cursed game that haunts friends forever. The glow of their laptops lit the small, cluttered dorm room, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. Alex sat at the head of the table, his fingers flying over the keyboard with a sense of purpose. The soft hum of the computer was the only sound in the room as he typed furiously, scanning through endless threads on a hidden corner of the internet. The page he was on was not like the usual social media sites or gaming forums they visited. No, this was something darker, something that seemed to pull them in with each click. It was an online forum where people shared stories of cursed games, games that were more than just simple distractions. These games were rituals, each one tied to ancient and forbidden practices. Some spoke of summoning spirits, others hinted at unlocking supernatural powers, and a few warned of opening doors to dimensions that no one should ever dare to explore. The thrill of the unknown was what called to Alex, what ignited his need for something more, something beyond the ordinary, something that would prove to him that the world was more than just the mundane. He could feel his heart racing as he scrolled through a list of the most infamous games: the elevator game, the closet game, the Candyman Summoning, the pencil game, and the devil's dice. Each one was more terrifying than the last, yet the stories left him with a sense of fascination, not fear. Alex had always prided himself on being skeptical of superstition, dismissing the eerie tales that circulated around campus. But this was something different. There was a thrill in the idea of proving these urban legends wrong, and showing that there was nothing supernatural about them, just stories twisted by fear and imagination. Samantha, sitting across the table, glanced at the screen with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She was more hesitant than Alex, her eyes darting between the glowing text and the dark corners of the room. Samantha had always been the introspective type, weighed down by the constant buzz of worry and anxiety. But even she couldn't deny the magnetic pull of the unknown. Despite her reservations, she found herself drawn into the idea of playing these games. It wasn't so much the thrill of the challenge as it was the urge to prove that she wasn't afraid of the darkness that lurked in the corners of her mind. Ethan, on the other hand, was already leaning forward in his seat, his eyes locked on the screen with a quiet intensity. Ethan was the quiet one, the type who kept to himself and often found solace in the pages of old occult books or the dusty corners of forgotten libraries. He had dabbled in the supernatural before, though never to the extent of these cursed games. But tonight, something felt different. There was a spark in his eyes, something dangerous, as if the allure of these games was calling to him in a way he couldn't resist. He'd heard the stories before, of course, who hadn't? But this was the first time he'd been this close to actually taking part. "We're doing this," Alex said with a confident grin, turning to face the group. "We can't just sit here and talk about it. If we're going to prove this is all a bunch of superstition, then we need to try it ourselves. We need to show that these games are just games." Samantha's fingers twitched nervously on the edge of her cup. "I don't know about this, Alex. What if something happens? What if we open a door we can't close?" Alex rolled his eyes, leaning back in his chair. "Come on, Sam. You're smarter than this. It's all just a bunch of stories. People get scared, and their brains play tricks on them. There's nothing real about it." Ethan said nothing at first. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. There was something about the way Alex spoke that made it clear he was trying to convince not only Samantha, but himself as well. Ethan knew better than to dismiss things so easily, but tonight felt different. There was a sense of inevitability hanging in the air, as if the darkness on the other side of those games was already beckoning them. "Fine," Samantha said after a long pause, her voice almost a whisper. "Let's do it, but I don't know if I can handle it if things get real." Alex shot her a reassuring smile. "Trust me, it's all in your head." But as the words left his lips, there was a weight in the room, a tension that none of them could shake. The glow of the computer screens cast a dim, eerie light over the room, as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting for them to make the wrong decision. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the night felt unusually still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. They sat in silence for a moment, the air thick with uncertainty. Then, without another word, Alex clicked on the first game. a game known as the elevator game, and they prepared to test the limits of their curiosity, unaware that they were about to open a door that should never have been opened. And so it began. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier as they followed the instructions, the air growing colder with each passing second. They could all feel it, the creeping sense of dread that slowly began to settle in their stomachs, tightening like a vice. As they moved forward, they could no longer deny that they had crossed a line, a point of no return. The games had begun. Story 1. The elevator game. Alex's heart was pounding in his chest as he stood in front of the aging elevator. The doors were slightly rusted, the buttons worn from years of use, and the air smelled faintly of mildew, but it didn't matter to him. He had read the instructions again, and the thrill of testing out this infamous game, this challenge, overpowered any lingering doubt. Samantha and Ethan stood beside him, the weight of their hesitation hanging heavily in the air, but Alex was resolute. He had been the one to bring them all this far. After all, now there was no turning back. Are you sure this is the place? Samantha's voice broke through the tension, her hand nervously clutching the strap of her bag. Her wide eyes darted around the empty lobby, trying to ignore the creaking sounds that echoed through the dilapidated hotel. The building was silent, almost too silent, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. "This is the one," Alex replied, his tone unwavering. He knew the risks, or at least he thought he did. The elevator game was well known for its spooky reputation, but surely it was just a series of carefully orchestrated steps that people had built up into a legend. There were no real ghosts, no otherworldly realms, just people convincing themselves that the ordinary was extraordinary. Ethan didn't say anything. He was standing a few feet away, his arms crossed, staring up at the ceiling with a distant look in his eyes. Ethan had always been quiet, introspective, and when it came to things like this, he was the one most likely to sit back and observe. Yet, there was a glimmer of intrigue in his eyes, something that suggested he was far from the skeptic Alex believed him to be. Alex stepped into the elevator first, pushing the button to open the doors. "All right, here goes," he muttered, trying to mask the excitement with an air of bravado. Samantha followed, reluctantly, with Ethan trailing behind her. The metal doors clanged shut behind them, trapping them in the narrow, stifling space. The elevator was small, just enough room for the three of them to stand without touching. It felt even more cramped now, like they were being enclosed in some unseen force. "Ready?" Alex asked, looking over his shoulder. Samantha bit her lip, clearly uneasy, but she nodded. Ethan gave a quiet grunt, his arms still crossed. Without waiting any longer, Alex pressed the first button, the first floor where they had entered the building. He then proceeded to follow the instructions they had carefully memorized, pushing the buttons in the specific order. 4th floor, 2nd floor, 6th floor, 10th floor, 5th floor. Each press of the button felt like another step toward the unknown, another beat of their hearts pounding in sync with the growing tension. As the elevator hummed and jerked with each floor, the building seemed to grow eerily quieter. The flickering of the overhead lights made the shadows seem to stretch longer, deeper. There was something about this hotel. It wasn't like the modern, sterile places they were used to. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and the faint scent of something sour lingered in the corners of the room. Finally, Alex pressed the last button, the one that would supposedly take them to another dimension. The elevator jolted to a sudden stop. For a moment, nothing happened. No sounds, no movement, just an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Samantha was the first to break the silence. "Alex, this doesn't feel right. We should stop." But Alex only smiled, confident that they had made it through. "It's fine. We're just..." Before he could finish his sentence, the elevator doors slowly opened, revealing a hallway. But this was no ordinary hallway. The walls were cracked, the wallpaper peeling, and there was a thick layer of dust on the floor. The air was cold, too cold for an old hotel, and the light from the elevator cast long shadows across the room. "This isn't the same floor," Samantha whispered, her voice shaking. Her instinct screamed that something was horribly wrong. Ethan stepped forward, his brow furrowing. "I've never seen this before." The elevator doors closed behind them, and as they turned, the sound of the old machinery echoed through the hallway, sudden and jarring. But then the echo faded, replaced by an almost suffocating silence. The atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer the eerie stillness of a forgotten hotel, but something far darker, more oppressive. There was a weight in the air, a sense of dread that made it hard to breathe. Samantha felt a cold chill run down her spine. "We need to go. Now!" But it was too late. Before they could even move, they noticed something. The elevator wasn't there anymore. The doors had vanished, leaving only a barren wall in its place. The three of them stood in that hallway, the feeling of being trapped creeping in. Alex's bravado faltered as his eyes scanned the surroundings. The building was not what it had seemed moments ago. The walls were too old, the dust too thick, and the air too heavy with something unseen. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a faint, distant sound, the sound of footsteps. The echo was distant at first, as if coming from deep within the bowels of the hotel. But as they listened, the footsteps grew louder, closer. They froze. It was as if the building itself was alive, watching them, aware of their presence. "What is that?" Samantha whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan looked at Alex, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a flicker of fear. "This isn't right, man." The lights above flickered, casting the hallway into an even darker shadow. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the elevator started moving. They had no choice but to step inside as it began to ascend, rapidly, faster than any elevator should. The sound of the machine was deafening, the walls trembling with each ascent. The elevator shot upwards, each floor passing by in the blink of an eye. They clung to the walls, their fear now palpable, as they waited for the lift to stop. When it finally did, the doors opened, and they found themselves back outside. But when they stepped out into the hallway, they realized that nothing was as it had been. The hotel was completely deserted. The lobby, once filled with dust and the scent of decay, was now entirely void of life. There were no other guests, no staff members, no sounds of people moving around. It was as though the hotel had never existed in the first place. "Where are we?" Samantha's voice quivered. Her eyes darted around, trying to find something familiar, but there was nothing, not even the elevator they had just ridden. Alex took a few hesitant steps forward. "This is impossible." The doors to the exit were locked. The group had now become prisoners in a hotel that was no longer real. Every room, every hallway, seemed like it was part of a twisted dream, one where reality and the supernatural collided. There was no way out. They were trapped. The elevator game had never been just a game, and now they would have to find a way to survive in a dimension that was far from their own. Story 2. The Closet Game. The night was thick with anticipation as Ethan stood in front of the narrow closet door. It was just like the other rooms they had explored in the hotel, aging, tired, and filled with a strange, lingering sense of history. But there was something different about this one, a gnawing sense that they had crossed a line they couldn't undo. They had already fallen deep into the rabbit hole of supernatural games, and now they were about to play one more. "This is it," Alex said, his voice low but tinged with excitement. "We've come this far. You can't back out now." Ethan didn't need convincing. He was already in the room, his back to the closet. He had always been the quiet one, the one who preferred to observe the others, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the thrill of the unknown, or maybe it was the need to prove something to himself. He was ready, or at least he thought he was. Samantha hesitated by the door, glancing nervously at Ethan. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan gave a tight-lipped smile, his voice steady despite the nerves coiling in his stomach. "It's just a game, nothing to be scared of." He reached for a small, porcelain doll from his pocket, a relic he had carried with him since childhood, one that had always brought him comfort. He grasped it tightly in his hand, its tiny, chipped face cold against his palm. "All right," Alex said, cutting through the silence. "Close the door, turn off the lights, and remember 3 times. Chant it 3 times, and we'll see what happens." Samantha flicked the light switch, plunging the room into darkness. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself as he positioned himself inside the small, cramped closet. The air felt thicker now, as though the shadows themselves had taken on weight. He closed the door behind him, the darkness absolute. The only sound was his breathing, slow and steady, until his voice broke through the silence. "Show me your name?" He whispered the first line of the chant. The room around him seemed to pulse with anticipation, and for a moment, the world felt too quiet, too still. The doll in his hand seemed to grow colder. "Show me your name," Ethan repeated, louder this time, a tremor in his voice that he couldn't shake. The silence pressed in again, and he whispered the chant a third time, a final, desperate breath escaping his lips. For a moment, nothing happened. The room felt almost too calm, like a trick played on him by his mind. But then, just as his heart started to relax, it began. The whispering. At first, it was faint like the hum of distant voices. But then the whispers grew louder, clearer, as though they were coming from just behind the door. Ethan. His breath caught in his throat. His name, spoken softly, chillingly from the other side. He froze. Was someone else in the room with him? The doll seemed to grow even colder in his hands, the porcelain edges biting into his skin. He pressed himself against the back of the closet, trying to listen. The whispering continued, but now it wasn't just his name. There were other voices, muffled, distant, sounding like they were calling to him from some far-off place. And then a deep, guttural voice joined in. "Ethan!" His body tensed. There was no way they could hear him from the other side of the door. No one else was in the room. Suddenly, the door rattled. The handle twisted, as if someone was trying to open it from the outside. Ethan's pulse raced, but his body refused to move. It was as if the darkness itself had frozen him in place. Then a figure appeared in the corner of his vision, shadowy and indistinct, a shape moving out of the dark. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the figure stepped closer, its form too faint to fully comprehend, but somehow he could feel its presence. The door creaked loudly, and Ethan's instinct screamed for him to open it. He reached out for the knob, but just as his hand touched the cold metal, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening, leaving Ethan standing alone in the dark, his pulse racing. "Ethan?" Alex called from the other side. "Ethan, you all right?" Ethan opened the door slowly, his hands shaking. He expected to see the others standing there, confused, perhaps laughing at his nerves. But when the door swung open, there was nothing in the hallway. The shadows of the hotel stretched deep into the corners, but the figure was gone. Ethan stepped out of the closet, disoriented. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something had followed him out. The others were watching him, their faces tight with concern. "You good?" Alex asked, raising an eyebrow. Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. He nodded, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Yeah, I'm fine." But deep down, he knew he wasn't fine. He could feel it. Later that night, after they had tried to laugh off the events, Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His room was quiet, the same silence he had always known, but something felt different. Something was in the shadows. As he rolled over, the closet door across the room creaked open. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The door wasn't just ajar, it was wide open, as though it had been waiting for him. The shadows inside the closet seemed to shift, almost alive. He sat up, his mind racing. He could hear faint whispers coming from the dark space, soft, like the hum of insects, but too clear to ignore. His name, the same voice. Ethan. His pulse quickened. He couldn't move. It was as if the darkness itself was calling to him, pulling him in. For the rest of the night, Ethan lay there, eyes wide, staring at the open closet door. He didn't sleep, too afraid to close his eyes. The whispers never stopped, and worse, he couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching him, something far older and far darker than anything he had ever imagined. The next day, things only grew stranger. Ethan began to lose time. He would wake up in places he didn't remember going, his clothes changed, his hair out of place, as though he had been somewhere else entirely. Each time, the memories were hazy, as if someone had wiped them from his mind. His friends noticed the change in him, but they chalked it up to stress or exhaustion. But deep down, Ethan knew the truth. The closet game hadn't been just a game. It had followed him, and it was growing stronger. The figure that had appeared in the closet, had it really been a figure at all? Or was it something more, something that didn't belong in this world? Ethan didn't know. All he knew was that the shadows were closing in, and no matter how hard he tried to escape, they were always there, waiting, watching. The game wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. Story 3. The Candyman Summoning. The group stood in the center of the hotel room, the air thick with a sense of dread. Ethan, Alex, and Samantha were gathered around an old, cracked mirror, its surface reflecting a twisted version of their faces. The mirror was the only piece of furniture in the otherwise barren room, save for the flickering light bulb overhead. It had become the focal point of their descent into madness, a symbol of the horrors they were now beginning to face. Alex was the first to speak, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over them. "All right, the Candyman. This one's supposed to be the most dangerous of all. You sure you're ready for this, Sam?" Samantha swallowed hard, her palms sweating. She had been terrified ever since they had discussed the game, but a part of her felt like she had to go through with it. She couldn't be the one to back out now, not after everything they had already seen. "I'll do it," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Ethan gave her a look of concern, but didn't argue. "Just remember, if anything happens, we get out of here. No second chances." Samantha nodded, stepping closer to the mirror, her reflection distorted in the old glass. The atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, thicker as she positioned herself. "All right, Candyman," she whispered, almost to herself. 5 times. Alex and Ethan both stepped back, standing close to the door, ready to leave at the slightest sign of danger. Their eyes never left Samantha as she took a deep breath, her fingers clenched into fists at her sides. "Candyman, Candyman, 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 Candyman." With the last syllable hanging in the air, the lights above them flickered and dimmed, casting the room into an eerie half-darkness. Samantha felt a cold chill crawl up her spine, as if the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees in an instant. She took a step back, but something stopped her, her reflection in the mirror. It wasn't her anymore. The face staring back at her was twisted, its features elongating and distorting, as if something inside the glass was trying to force its way out. The figure in the mirror smirked, its eyes glowing with malice. The air around them thickened, and a low, guttural sound emanated from the depths of the mirror, a sound that could only be described as a growl. Samantha's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled backward. It's him. It's Candyman." The reflection in the mirror shifted violently, and suddenly, the room plunged into complete darkness. The cold intensified, and the sound of buzzing, like a swarm of flies, filled the air. Ethan and Alex looked at each other, panic setting in. They were no longer certain this was just a game. This was something else entirely. From the corner of the room, a faint whisper cut through the buzzing. "I'm here." It was a voice, but not one they recognized. It wasn't Samantha's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice. It was deeper, darker, a growl that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the hotel. The sound sent a jolt of fear through them, and without thinking, they ran toward the door. But the door wouldn't open. They tried again, pulling and pushing, but the handle was stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Samantha turned back to the mirror, her heart pounding. The figure of Candyman was no longer confined to the glass. His face had emerged from the reflection, hovering just behind her, his dark eyes locked onto hers. He was tall, towering over her, with a face obscured by shadows, save for a faint, bloodied smile. His presence felt suffocating, pressing in on them from all sides. He spoke again, his voice a chilling rasp. "You called me, and now I am here." Before Samantha could react, a sharp, cold wind swept through the room, slamming her back against the wall. Her vision blurred, and her body was paralyzed with fear as Candyman's voice rang out in her ears. "Now, you will all pay the price." The lights flickered once more, and the figure of Candyman was gone, leaving behind only a lingering presence. The door creaked open of its own accord, but as they rushed out into the hall, the group was met with an unsettling silence. That silence was quickly shattered by the sound of whispers, the same voice that had haunted them before. Candyman, Candyman. It was coming from the mirrors now. Every mirror in the hotel seemed to vibrate with the same dark energy. The whispers were louder, more insistent. The group turned, eyes wide, as they realized that Candyman wasn't just in the mirrors anymore. He was in the very air around them. Panic set in as they fled down the hotel's empty corridors. But no matter where they went, Candyman's presence lingered. It wasn't just the whispers now. He was appearing in places he shouldn't be. In one of the hotel rooms, a reflection of the spirit stared back at them from the cracked bathroom mirror. In another, his figure loomed in the window, watching them as they ran. He was everywhere. They couldn't escape him. The haunting grew worse over time, escalating from visions and whispers to physical attacks. Objects moved without explanation. The air grew colder, and they began seeing Candyman's figure in the corner of their eyes, always watching, always lurking. Then one day, something shifted. Ethan, the skeptic who had been the most dismissive of the games, began acting strangely. At first, they attributed it to the stress and the mounting terror. But there was something wrong in his eyes, something dark, something that didn't belong. One evening, as they huddled in a room, trying to come to grips with what was happening, Ethan stood up, his face blank and void of expression. "I'm sorry, but I have to finish what we started," he said, his voice eerily calm. Before anyone could react, Ethan's hands shot out, grabbing Alex by the throat and slamming him against the wall. Samantha screamed, but it was too late. Ethan's eyes had gone completely black, his pupils swirling with malevolent energy. Candyman had taken over. He wasn't just a spirit in the mirrors anymore. He had found a vessel, a new host to carry out his vengeful spree. The curse had spread, and there was no escape. Alex struggled to break free, but Ethan's strength had become unnaturally powerful. Candyman's laughter filled the room, echoing in their ears as Ethan, now fully possessed, laughed along with it. Samantha backed away, horrified, as Ethan turned toward her, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "You can't stop this. The curse is alive now. It's within me," he whispered. The world around them shifted, the shadows growing deeper, the whispers louder. The spirit was no longer confined to the mirrors. It had spread, infecting their very reality. And with each passing moment, Candyman's power grew stronger, more insistent, as he continued to terrorize the group one by one. The game had started as a simple summoning, but now it was a curse, an endless nightmare from which there was no escape. And it would not end until all of them had succumbed to the wrath of Candyman. Story 4. The Pencil Game. The group sat in a dimly lit room, a thick air of anticipation surrounding them. They had already endured the horrors of the other games, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't as widely known as the others, but there was an unsettling whisper about it. A game that could summon more than just spirits. It could summon something worse. The idea of invoking a demonic force through the simple act of drawing seemed absurd. Yet the tension in the room told them that this was no joke. Ethan, ever the skeptic, was the first to volunteer. He'd been the one to challenge every superstition and story so far, but as his hand hovered over the pencil, even his confidence faltered. He shook his head, forcing a nervous laugh. "It's just a pencil. How bad can it be?" The others exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them said anything. They had already come this far, and there was no turning back. Samantha swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you sure about this?" "Yeah," Ethan said, trying to sound reassuring, though his voice wavered. "It's just a stupid game. Watch, I'll show you." He pulled out a blank piece of paper and placed it flat on the table. The pencil, old and dull, was held tightly in his grip as he prepared to draw the symbol. The instructions they had found online were clear. Draw a specific symbol, a series of interwoven lines that looked almost like an occult sigil, and then chant the words that would supposedly summon the demon. "All right," Ethan muttered, "let's get this over with." The group gathered around, their eyes fixed on the paper as Ethan began to draw. The lines were shaky at first, but with each stroke, the pencil seemed to move more deliberately. His hand wasn't as steady as it had been earlier, and soon, it became clear that something wasn't right. The pencil seemed to move by itself, tracing strange patterns across the page that Ethan didn't intend. "Ethan, stop," Samantha urged, her voice laced with panic. But Ethan couldn't stop. His hand was gripped by something stronger than his will. The symbols began to twist and writhe on the page, changing shape into something far darker than anything he had imagined. The air in the room grew cold, and the faintest hint of a shadow began to form around them, stretching across the walls like something alive. "What's happening?" Alex whispered, his voice shaking with fear. The figure on the paper began to take form. It was not human, not even close. Its shape was abstract at first, twisting, writhing in a way that made the room feel as though it were closing in on them. Then, slowly, it began to solidify, its outline becoming clearer. A demonic face, its features contorted into a grotesque snarl. The eyes were black voids, filled with a malevolent hunger. A voice, deep and rasping, echoed from nowhere, seeming to come from all directions at once. "You've called me. You've invited me." Ethan froze, his grip tightening on the pencil. "What do you want?" His voice cracked, fear seeping through the bravado he had been desperately clinging to. The demonic voice responded with a mocking laugh, low and guttural. "I want you. I want your soul." Ethan's face twisted in terror as the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "I can give you power, strength, everything you desire. All you must do is sacrifice." The others tried to reach for Ethan, but their hands stopped just shy of him. The air was thick with an invisible pressure, making it impossible to get closer. Samantha backed away, her mind racing for a way to break the game, but the presence in the room was overwhelming. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, dark tendrils reaching toward Ethan. "Ethan!" Alex shouted, but it was no use. The words of the demon had already begun to sink in. "Sacrifice," Ethan repeated, his voice empty and distant. "Who will it be? Who will I choose?" The demon's form seemed to shift, its mouth opening impossibly wide as it whispered its terrible promises. "Take the life of one among you. Only then will you gain the power to break free. Only then will I release you." Samantha screamed, rushing forward, but the shadows pushed her back. She felt the cold, the overwhelming sensation that if they didn't stop Ethan now, they would lose him completely. "Ethan, don't listen to it. It's lying." But the demon's whispers were too strong. Ethan's eyes glowed with a strange light, his pupils dilated as though they no longer belonged to him. The pencil in his hand moved again, dragging across the page with no guidance from him, the lines forming a new, sinister shape, one that seemed to pulse with dark energy. "No," Ethan muttered, his voice breaking. I don't want to do this, but it's too late." He stood up suddenly, his movements jerky and unnatural, as though the demon was pulling the strings of his body. The group scrambled to stop him, but their hands passed through him, as if he were no longer solid. He stepped closer to Alex, who backed away in terror. "No," Alex gasped, shaking his head. "Ethan, please. You're not yourself. Don't do this." But Ethan wasn't listening. His hand raised the pencil above his head, poised to strike. His body trembled, as if fighting for control, but the demon's influence was too powerful. "Ethan, stop!" Samantha cried out, but it was too late. The pencil slipped from his hand, falling onto the paper. It rolled across the page, leaving behind a dark mark. The symbol had shifted, a new line drawn. This time, not on the paper, but across Ethan's own chest. The group froze, staring in horror as the symbol, glowing with an unnatural light, began to burn into Ethan's skin. The marks spread quickly, searing into his flesh as though they were being etched by a red-hot brand. Ethan screamed, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was the voice of the demon, laughing in ecstasy as the ritual reached its terrifying conclusion. Samantha rushed forward, trying to break the curse, but the shadows closed in around them, forcing them back. They watched in helpless horror as Ethan's eyes glazed over. His once familiar face now twisted with a dark, demonic grin. The demon had fully possessed him. As the last trace of Ethan's humanity faded, the figure of the demon materialized behind him. The group was frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Ethan, no longer Ethan, turned to face them, his eyes black pits of emptiness. "You should have never played the game," the demon hissed, its voice a mixture of Ethan's and something far worse. The pencil had fallen. The game was over, and the demon had won. In that moment, the group realized that there was no escape from this curse. The entity now lived within Ethan, and with it came the promise of endless torment. They had tried to stop it, but it was too late. The demon had claimed a vessel, and nothing they did could ever take it back. The game had been their last mistake. Story 5. The Devil's Dice. The room fell into an uneasy silence as the group gathered around the small, weathered table. A thick fog seemed to settle over them, both from the atmosphere of the room and the weight of the game they were about to play. This game was different from the others. There was no chanting, no dark symbols, no spirits to summon. Just a pair of dice, seemingly harmless, whose ancient cryptic rules had been passed down like a whispered curse. Alex, ever the leader of the group, was the first to speak. "The Devil's Dice," he murmured, eyes locked on the faded markings etched into the sides of the dice. They were unlike any dice they had ever seen. Each face was carved with strange symbols, and the numbers were not in any language they recognized. "Are we really going to do this?" Samantha's voice was trembling. She had heard rumors about this game, about the horrors it brought to those foolish enough to play. But Alex had insisted. He was always the one to challenge the others, to push them into the darkest corners of their fears. "We have to finish what we started," Alex said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the flicker of doubt that had started to settle in his chest. He picked up the dice with trembling hands and held them out to the group. "We roll one at a time. Whatever happens, we deal with it together. No one backs down." The group hesitated, but one by one, they agreed, each of them haunted by the thought that there was no way to escape now. The die had already been cast. Alex rolled the dice first, watching them tumble across the table, spinning end over end before they came to a rest. He leaned forward to see the result, and his face drained of color. The dice had landed with a strange symbol, a jagged mark, on one side. The other side bore the number 3, a number that carried no significance they could recognize. The air in the room seemed to change in that instant. It was subtle at first, a faint pressure building, but then it became undeniable. The sound of tires screeching against asphalt pierced the silence, and the windows rattled with an eerie force. Without warning, a horrifying crash echoed through the room, the unmistakable sound of metal twisting and breaking. The group rushed to the window, only to see a car, its front end crushed against the side of a building, smoke billowing from the wreckage. The crash had been violent, deadly. Alex's face paled as he stumbled back from the window, his eyes wide with disbelief. "That's not possible," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. We didn't cause that." The others looked at each other, their stomachs turning. But before anyone could say anything, Alex picked up the dice again, shaking off the creeping dread that had settled over him. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back now. "Let's just keep going," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Samantha and Ethan exchanged wary glances, but they said nothing. One by one, they took their turns, each of them rolling the dice with a sense of foreboding, as though they could feel the game's dark power growing stronger with every roll. Ethan rolled next. His dice landed on the symbol of a skull and the number 7. A chill ran through the room, and the lights flickered, casting long, unnerving shadows against the walls. The floor beneath them seemed to tremble as though the very foundation of the building was giving way. There was a sense of wrongness in the air, like something ancient and dangerous was awakening. Then they heard it, a soft whisper, a voice that seemed to come from nowhere, yet was everywhere at once. Betrayal. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of his friends. They hadn't spoken. The word had come from nowhere, but it had been clear, sharp as a knife. The whisper seemed to pierce his soul, filling him with a deep sense of unease. "Who said that?" Ethan's voice was hoarse. His hands were clammy as he gripped the table, trying to steady himself. No one answered. The next roll was Samantha's. She picked up the dice with trembling hands, casting a nervous glance at Alex. As the dice rolled across the table, she closed her eyes, dreading what would come next. The dice came to rest. This time, the symbols were even darker, a twisted face and the number 9. There was a long, heavy pause before the lights flickered again, this time plunging the room in a near-complete darkness. The air grew thick with tension, and an oppressive silence settled over them, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Then, slowly, the room seemed to warp, the walls stretching and distorting in unnatural ways. The temperature dropped drastically, and a cold, suffocating presence filled the space, pressing in on them. The whispers returned, louder now, crawling into their minds. "Madness!" Samantha gasped, her pulse racing. She turned to Alex, her face pale with fear. "What's happening? What have we done?" Alex didn't have an answer. He could feel the weight of the game's curse bearing down on him, and he knew that it was only going to get worse. They took turns rolling the dice now, their hands unsteady, their minds clouded with fear. Each roll brought new consequences, each one darker, more deadly than the last. First, it was a shadow that seemed to move on its own, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then it was a door that slammed shut, trapping them inside. The room seemed to twist and contort around them, like the very fabric of reality was unraveling with each roll. Finally, the dice came back to Alex. His heart pounded in his chest, sweat dripping down his forehead. He had seen what had happened to the others, and he knew that the game had become too dangerous. He should stop. He should put an end to it. But he couldn't. Something about the dice, the dark power they wielded, compelled him to roll once more. He shook the dice in his hands, his fingers numb, and let them fall. They bounced once, twice, and then came to rest. The symbol that appeared on the dice was unrecognizable, a twisted form of chaos, and the number 13 glowed in a deep red. A guttural growl erupted from somewhere deep within the room, and the air seemed to warp. The ground shook beneath their feet, the walls crumbling as if they were nothing more than paper. The room itself seemed to tear open, revealing a darkness that was not of this world. The devil had entered. The group backed away, fear freezing them in place. The once closed window shattered, the wind howling through the broken glass as shadows poured in, creeping along the floor and walls like living things. The whispers grew louder, now impossible to ignore. The gate is open. The pact is sealed. Alex turned, his face drained of color, as he saw the shape in the doorway, tall, imposing, and filled with an otherworldly presence. It was more than just a shadow. It was a being of pure malevolence, the devil himself, walking into their world. "No!" Samantha gasped, her voice barely audible. "What have we done?" The devil's grin was sharp and knowing, and as he stepped forward, the room seemed to collapse into darkness, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and decay. The last roll had not just affected them, it had opened the gates of hell itself. And now, there was no escape. The devil's laughter echoed as the room plunged into oblivion, signaling the start of a chain of catastrophic events that would destroy everything they had ever known. The dice had been cast. The game was over. The darkness that surrounded each of these games was more than just the shadowy figures, the whispers from beyond, or the physical manifestations of evil. It was a reflection of something deeper, something far more unsettling, our own willingness to invite danger, to push boundaries, and to tempt forces we do not understand. These games, each one seemingly harmless at the outset, all serve as a chilling reminder of how fragile the line is between curiosity and catastrophe. The thrill of the unknown, the rush of power that comes with controlling the unseen, is an irresistible allure for many. But once you cross that line, there's no turning back. The games may seem like mere folklore or urban legends at first, stories passed down around campfires, warnings wrapped in riddles. But in the world these stories unfold, the danger is real. With every roll of the dice, every chant in the dark, every mark drawn in blood or pencil, the boundaries between our world and the world of spirits, demons, and curses blur. What started as a simple dare or challenge transforms into a nightmarish fight for survival. And once you invite the darkness in, it never truly leaves. Each of the characters in these stories learn too late that the consequences of playing with the unknown are far worse than they ever anticipated. Ethan, Samantha, Alex, each of them thought they could control the game, that they could stop it when things went too far. But the very nature of these games is their power over you. They pull you deeper into their grip, and with every attempt to stop, the cost rises. They are a reminder that some things should remain untouched, some boundaries should not be crossed, and some games should never be played. But perhaps the greatest lesson in these stories is that we are often our own worst enemies. It is not just the dark forces at play that bring about ruin. It is the choices of those who dare to summon them, who believe they can control what cannot be controlled. The games are not just tests of courage or strength. They are reflections of our inner desires, our curiosity, our need for power, and ultimately, our downfall. As we close this chapter of Twisted Tales, it's important to reflect on the deeper implications of these stories. They are not just about spirits, demons, or cursed objects. They are about the risks we take when we think we can outsmart the forces that govern the universe. In the end, these stories serve as a grim reminder. Some games are meant to be left unplayed. Some forces are too dangerous to summon. And sometimes, the scariest thing is not the darkness itself, but the things we bring into it. In our search for thrills, we may open doors we can never close. And when that happens, the consequences may be far more than we bargained for. So, the next time you hear of a game whispered in the dark, remember the stories of Ethan, Samantha, Alex, and others who played with fire, only to be consumed by it. The devil, the spirits, the darkness, they are always waiting, just a roll of the dice away, ready to remind us that some games come with no winners, only losers in the end.